Well, we are into, I believe, the biggest and fastest geopolitical shifts of power in the world since the fall of the Iron Curtain. Just over the last few weeks, incredible things have happened that we need to understand to be prepared for these times. I believe the world economy has also had some of its biggest shifts, and I think in relation to that, we could say suffered some of its biggest shifts, the beginning of some of the biggest crises in recent times. And I believe it does mark the beginning of a very serious worldwide decline in the economy. Now, Lord willing, it will be slow and controlled. And I say Lord willing because we've, really for years and years have been tottering right on the brink of economic meltdown and catastrophe. And I believe the only reason we haven't had that happen yet is because of God's grace. And that's the one economic factor we don't know how to measure. I mean, his grace is usually way beyond and much more than ours. And, if you've ever looked at all the different threats to the earth, to the existence of the earth in the universe, I've seen documentaries and specials on this. You wonder how does planet Earth make it through a single day with the whole universe trying to kill us? From gamma bursts, from meteorites, from all kinds of things that are happening in the universe. Well, we're making it because we're being kept. And I believe the Lord is keeping us too, and he's keeping us on planet Earth. He's keeping our individual lives. But what is happening? And we like to address things that we address around, the three great questions that were first, I think, spoken or elaborated on by Colonel Moore. If you ever saw the movie We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and Mel Gibson played Colonel Moore, and he was almost court-martialed for that battle when over and over in debriefing the soldiers, they said the colonel was sleeping during the most intense parts of the battle. So he almost got court-martialed for dereliction of duty, sleeping when the battle was going on. And when they questioned him about it, he said, I wasn't sleeping. He said, I was trying to tune out all of the noise, all of the clutter, so that I could answer three questions. And they said, what questions? And he said, what is happening? What is not happening? And what can I do about it? And instead of court-martialing him, they wrote those three questions into the U.S. Army manual. These are the three questions you ask in any crisis. What is happening? And you want to take out of that what is not happening. You don't want to deal with things that are just based on fear and everything else, but don't have substance behind it. You want to deal with what is happening. You want to know what's not happening, but then you want to know also, what can I do about it? What should I do about it? Now, I've go through the headlines, and these are just some recent ones that I think are very telling of the world economic situation that I know you guys are getting more and more in tune with. And what we try to do with our television viewers is help over a period of time. If you watch our programs, you get an education. You start to understand world economic issues and factors, and so you can start discerning on your own what is going on in the world. And of course, I'm also speaking to many who have great understanding, great depth here, so you automatically get it right away. But here's one headline. I got a lot of these from Drudge Report and from Fox News iPad app and everything, where I go and get a lot of my news, mostly Drudge. They have some of the best resources and material, and they draw from all kinds of resources, credible resources, and just post them on their iPad app. But anyway, here's one headline: $3 trillion of corporate debt credit crunch looms as debtors face day of reckoning, says the IMF, International Monetary Fund. Now, here's what they said. Governments and central banks risk tipping the world into a fresh financial crisis. The International Monetary Fund warned it is called time on corporate debt binge in the developing world. It's time to call timeout on the corporate credit binge or debt binge in the developing world. And they talk about how the emerging market companies have overborrowed by $3 trillion in just the last decade. Now they go on to say this dangerous over leveraging now threatens to unleash a wave of defaults that will imperil already weak global economies. Now they go on to talk about this in depth. I just want you to think about this as one factor we're going to talk about. Now this came out October the 7th. The other, by the way, they showed some graphs in this article of the private sector debt to GDP. Now, we know the government sector debt, the U.S. government debt, is now about approaching 115% of GDP. Very dangerous, where they say you should never go. Government debt should never get even close to 100% of GDP. We're now gone way past it to 115%. Guess what? Private sector debt is now approaching 180% of GDP in these countries. In most countries, in the U.S., or I should say more the advanced economies together, are all approaching 180%. That is really scary if you understand the world economic situation. Now, at the same time, another headline came out about the same time. Payrolls disaster. Only 142,000 jobs added in September. Zero wage growth. August revives much lower. Now, we need to add somewhere around 300,000 jobs a month to our market just to take care of increasing growth in our population. It's people coming of age who want a job, and it spikes at different times of the year, like around graduation when all the graduates are hitting the markets. But it's about an average. We need to add about 300,000 jobs every month. It's been a long time since we've been doing that. And we've lost so many jobs, but for it to go all the way as low as half of what we need, and they called it, this was their words, it was a total disaster. 60,000 below the consensus estimate. So some things are happening. There are factors that are causing the very few people or companies hiring, new jobs being created. This is devastating. And one other factor too, employment by illegal aliens went up. It was everybody else, all the citizens of America across the board. The one people group that lost the most jobs were women. And but everybody else, American citizens, lost all the rest. We lost tens of thousands of jobs. And only 142,000 new jobs were created. Another article right here, U.S. hiring slowed as global economy weakened. What's doing this? What is causing this weakening? Now, here's a good one. A record 94,610,000 Americans not in the labor force. That's almost 100 million Americans. That's about 35% of Americans. These are employable Americans, they say, between the ages of 16 and over that could be in the labor force, are not in the labor force, and yet they said our unemployment is only 5.1%. Somebody's lying to us. Now, I know you guys know that. I mean, our government has changed the factors they use for computing these things to continually make their employment looks so much better. But what they're doing is they're only counting those who are seeking employment or those who are getting unemployment benefits, which those only last so long. When you go off those rolls, they take them out of you, the factor. But there's still Americans who are not working who should be working. Getting a third of our workforce, almost a third of our workforce, or actually a little over. So what in the world is going on here? Here's another factor. Now, I'm just building, these are little dials that let us know where the economy is. Here's one other factor we just want to consider. Government workers study. This is Elizabeth Harrington wrote this, and government workers make 78% more than private sector. Now, let me read this to you. Employees for the federal government earn more than their counterparts in the private sector, according to a new study by the Cato Institute. Federal workers' pay and benefits were 78% higher than private employees. This is a major, major factor we need to understand in our economy. Why do we need to understand the impact of federal employees, government employees, making 78% more than their counterpart in the private sector? One thing, we know the government does not make anything marketable. Government does not add to the GDP. So if the only things that bring in taxes, that bring in resources, that create the economy are things that are created for the marketplace. Now, the government is supposed to be like the referee to provide a level playing field for everyone. Of course, it supplies our defense and our infrastructure. It does a lot for us. I'm thankful for our government, but I think it's hugely bloated. But what is going to happen to the best and the brightest? Where are they going to go to get a job? If the marketplace is what's creating the wealth of a nation and the resources to provide for strong defense, to provide for a quality infrastructure, to provide for all of the different, ways that we do need to referee the economy and things that are going on for our police forces, our first responders, everything else. We need to do all this, but all those resources come from what the market is creating to bring in the wealth into the country. And the best and brightest are no longer going to the market. They're going to the government for employment. And do you know that the main area of jobs growth in the U.S. has been government jobs, not the marketplace? And a lot of the job statistics that we're reading about, if it weren't for the government adding all kinds of people who, in my opinion, are not doing anything productive, even for what the government is supposed to do. Many years ago, over 2 decades ago, there were studies done on U.S. government agencies that determined that for every $10 going into these major government agencies, only $1 was making it through the sieve of government bureaucracy to actually get to the need and the purpose of that agency. And we had many overlapping agencies and whole agencies in our government that really effectively were not doing anything productive anymore. Had no reason to exist, except nobody would cut them. But we go on paying for them, and we're so overblown. Our U.S. government should be about, at the very most, 1/5 of the size that it is now. And if it were that small, it could probably do a much better job. But now you got people sitting around, just all they have to do is to seem like they're doing something productive, create more regulations that is a bigger weight on the private sector, who are trying to create a market, something marketable. And then you have to pay more taxes, and our economy has to carry that much huger tax load than normal. And then we wonder why we're no longer competitive in the world market. Now, back in the Carter administration, they did a study. They estimated at the time that small business was less than, well, back then they thought it was around 5% of the U.S. economy. They defined small business as a business with 25 employees or less. And most they thought it was maybe up to 10%. But most at the time believed that it was about 5% of our economy. So they did a study on how much does small business contribute to the U.S. economy. To their shock, they concluded that small business in America was 50% of the economy, that half of the people with jobs in America worked in small businesses that had 25 employees or less, and that at least 75%, some studies it was as high as almost 80% of all new jobs created in America were created by small business. So it's not only the main jobs producer in America, it's half the economy. Now we're wiping out. There have been some things done by our government, our federal government, that is virtually wiping out the pipeline of small business. And virtually every big business started as a small business. If you shut off the pipeline of new small business, it is going to have devastating consequences. Now, our pipeline's been squeezing, shutting down more and more every year. It's virtually about to shut off the pipeline of small business, where it's going to be extremely hard for anyone to take the initiative to start a small business in America. Now, Dodd-Frank, I think, is one of the most devastating pieces of legislation ever in the history of America to be crushing to small business. What it's doing, it's crushing to small banks. They put such onerous regulations on all banks that it takes about several $100,000 just to do this, keep up with this regulation, to do all the stress tests and everything else. If you're going to be a bank, that you've got to do. Now, the big banks can handle that. The small ones can't. The small community banks, they just can't handle tagging on another $300,000 to $400,000 a year in extra costs just to comply with government regulations. So what's it doing? They're shutting down more and more. Credit unions are doing okay. They're not doing that great either, but small community banks are drying up because they can't handle this. Small community banks are the lifeline for startup businesses. And as you see those crushed and removed from the American economic landscape, the consequences are going to be absolutely devastating for the American economy. And what they're trying to do is centralize the banks. They're trying to centralize everything the government. Listen, find anybody in government who really understands business. Almost everything they try to do to help business is counterproductive. It hurts it. And they're just piling on more and more. These things have to change. Now, so we've got several major factors shutting down small business. Dodd-Frank, the worst taxes you'll find anywhere in the world, corporate taxes, unbearable regulation, and then maybe the worst of all, Obamacare. I believe Obamacare is going to unfold as the most devastating legislation, worse than Dodd-Frank, worse than anything else, to the American economy. I don't see how it can survive it without radical, profound change. Now, you think, well, there are plenty of countries that have nationalized health care. Theirs were done better than ours. Ours is the most maddening, incomprehensible, foolish, and restrictive and crushing. It's man. As a manager, you look at this and say, it's not possible to manage this monster. And we're already suffering terrible consequences of the cost of our health care rising dramatically. Remember, we were promised by our president our costs would go down. They've almost doubled for everybody. already, and there's no end in sight to how much they're going to, the weight that is going to be on us. The regulations are quite unbelievable. We recently talked to a doctor's office that it had to shut down for a few days just to add, I think they said 80,000 new codes. They were working on 14,000 codes, I think, for different things, for government reporting and all, for, they have a code for every type of medical procedure or drug or everything else. Well, Obamacare added 80,000. So to the already horrendous number. So here's another one. The threat of not complying with Obamacare, the fine is right now this is a changing thing too. They're going back and retroactively changing this law. But the threat is a $100 per day per employee fine. Now, just with us, our little organization, we sat there and counted, that's over 10,000 a day. And, here's the worst part. We're trying to comply. We've been bringing in experts, asking them, how do we do this? One will tell us one thing, the other one will come in and completely, absolutely contradict what the last one said. We're doing our best to try to obey the law as much as we can. We can't figure it out, and we haven't found anyone yet that could figure this out for us and our organization. Now that they keep changing the rules and making them retroactive, how crazy is that? Well, there will be huge consequences. Wait as this thing hits, and a lot of these most onerous regulations hit in 2016. Just wait for what it does then.